So Canada has picked a fight with a much bigger opponent, and it's one that could have some serious impacts on average Canadians. And it's resulting in the leader of a Canadian political party being labeled as a terrorist supporter, with some analysts saying that this whole ordeal could just be a convenient distraction from what Canadian citizens ought to be worried about in order to help a struggling government. I'm talking about the new claims that the Canadian government is making, saying that the Indian government has been tied to a murder on Canadian soil. And let me clarify, this might sound like a geopolitical issue that might not apply to you, but how this goes could have serious impacts on Canadians in terms of housing, as well as which government will be in power and when. Now, let me give you a vastly oversimplified breakdown and some context on this whole situation. There's a group of people, and some people label them as terrorists, and some people label them as activists, and depending on which interpretation you go by, you'll have vastly different opinions on the matter. This group is a subsection of the Sikh religious group who believe that they deserve space in the north of India to be their own independent state so that they're not governed by the Indian central government. These two sort of sides have clashed in multiple different events over the past decades. Now, if this region of India were to separate from India, it would be called Khalistan, and as a result, the people who are fighting for that to happen are called Khalistani supporters, or supporters of Khalistan. And on Monday, the Prime Minister came out and said that he has credible intelligence that India was involved in the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil, something that obviously isn't allowed and is a big deal. But depending on which side you're viewing this from, this Canadian citizen is either seen as a Khalistani activist or a Khalistani terrorist. And Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, labels this person as an activist, but the Indian government says, no, you're actually talking about a terrorist.
I want to speak directly to people of Indian descent who have come to Canada, who spoke justice and spoke truth to power, who challenged the oppressive practices of India, caste violence, violence against women, systemic abuse of minority communities, systemic abuse of the poor. I want to speak directly to those activists. Governments around the world are trying to silence you. The Indian government and the Modi government specifically is attempting to silence you. But truth cannot be silenced. Justice cannot and will not be silenced.
But on the flip side of things, Indian news agencies are saying that Canada is giving safe haven to terrorists and have a growing reputation of doing so, right? So obviously we have two different interests here, two different views of the situation with vastly different interpretations of that situation. And the Indian news media are saying that Jagmeet Singh himself is a Khalistani separatist, and saying that the Trudeau government, because it's backed by the NDP right now, that's the only reason we're not having an election, while they say that they're okay, they have to serve the interests of this individual, and that's why he's making these claims now. Now, this is all a very big deal, not only because of the severity of the accusations, but also because of the gravity of the impact on Canada due to this potential deterioration in relationships with India and the $8 billion of trade we do with India each year. Now, there's a large amount of fog around this situation, so much so that nobody really knows the truth of what actually happened here. But when we look at the incentives for the Canadian government and how those incentives impact how they've handled this situation versus how they've handled the previous situations that are similar, well, a number of red flags stand up for me. And let me be clear here, there is some speculation and some prediction baked in here, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but this is how I'm currently viewing things based off of the news that I've consumed. Obviously, this is a story that has some amount of teeth, right? And a government being involved in the murder on another country's soil is obviously a big deal if it is true. But the timing of it, to me, seems a little bit weird. We've got the Liberal government down in the polls right now, getting hammered by the Conservatives on affordability, and they drastically need to shift the focus away from the cost of living. A situation like this definitely shifts the focus of the news and what some Canadians are thinking about, right? And now on top of that, let's think about, okay, what are the other sort of interference allegations that have been happening over the past 6 months? Of course, there were all these scandals leaked about Chinese interference and how they potentially aided the Liberals in previous elections. And when that happened, we didn't see any major statements from the government about these allegations. They tried to keep it super private, super confidential, and rather obscure, making it so you couldn't really know what was true. Now compare that to this situation where the moment the media releases information about the allegations, the Prime Minister stands up in Parliament in the House of Commons and makes a very grave statement about the allegations that this could have potentially happened and could be linked to the Indian government. Now, why the different tone now versus before when we were talking about China, right? Certainly it could be that the Prime Minister has more information and more pieces of intelligence on this issue than he did on the previous Chinese issue, but there's no way to know that that is true, right? Because all of this information is highly classified and not for average Canadian citizens to know. And this is all happening amidst these allegations that Chinese agents effectively threatened the family of a sitting Canadian MP, Michael Chong, and he was actually recently called to Washington to testify to the American politicians about this situation. Now, with both of these things going on at the same time, it kind of muddies the waters and makes it harder for average Canadians to sort of parse apart the Prime Minister's track record on foreign interference, right? And when people say, hey, you're not strong enough on foreign interference, when you're talking about this sort of handling of the Chinese election interference, now he can just come back and say, what are you talking about? Whenever foreign powers seek to interfere, I call it out even publicly. Just look at this situation with India, right? It makes these sort of two different conversations sort of muddy into one, and sort of kind of makes it harder to view his track record on a broader issue. Am I making sense here? And these items that I'm bringing up here are narratives that the Indian government has sort of clinged on to similarly. Here's a clip from the Indian Congress leader and some of his thoughts.
The extraordinary decision of the Prime Minister to go public with an allegation without a shred of evidence of Indian government complicity in a murder in his country shocks me, to be very frank. I believe the story is that it was triggered by the fact that a media leak was about to happen of this allegation. A media story is one thing for a Prime Minister, for political reasons, to want to get ahead of a media story. It really looks like it's doubling down on the pandering to a certain political element in that country.
He says that there isn't a shred of evidence, but at this point we don't really know if that's true, right? The shadow of the saying we can't share this stuff because it's national security information, it compromises our relationships with our security allies. It's a convenient fog, but a fog that is real, right? We can't go around sharing national security intelligence with the general public all the time, and certainly relationships with our security allies could be sacrificed if we do so, right? But it is certainly a convenient fog to be able to say, hey, we can't share details about this because we can't. And we saw this all with the allegations of Chinese interference over the past 6 months. It's super hard to make Canadians feel confident that these matters are being handled in an appropriate way when the very nature of the matters makes it so that Canadians can't know all the details. So some Canadians are taking a wait-and-see approach to this issue, waiting for more evidence which we may or may not get in the future.
The Prime Minister hasn't provided any facts. He provided a statement, and I will just emphasize that he didn't tell me any more in private than he told Canadians in public, so we want to see more information. I do find it interesting that he knew about vast foreign interference by Beijing for many years, at the same time as Beijing had kept 2 Canadian citizens hostage, and he said nothing and he did nothing. Just very, very interesting that was the approach he took in that case.
Now, we've since gotten more information about what type of intelligence the government says they have, but we haven't gotten clarity on exactly what was said. They say that they have a sort of testimony from individuals, as well as sort of direct communications between Indian diplomats that they say prove that this is something that happened. But certainly if relationships deteriorate between these two countries, it could have major impacts for Canadians. Already the Indian government has stopped giving out visas to Canadians to visit the country entirely. And then there is this additional link to the international student flow from India to Canada. We see down here that Canada has issued 997,000 study permits to Indian students since 2015, something that could be compromised if the crisis becomes worse. Now, this will have some impacts on Canadians, especially when we look at the sort of rental housing situation. Of course, this article talks about it in terms of economic terms, GDP. Universities would no longer be able to exploit these students and get them to pay double tuition while not having any way to house them. So this other side effect is that, okay, demand for rental housing in university towns could go down if this situation gets worse. But all in all, I find it pretty hard to believe that Trudeau and the Liberals would just make something up that's this severe and has such giant consequences. But at the same time, when you contrast this to the way that the Chinese interference situation played out, well, interference that allegedly aided the Liberals directly, well, the contrast in their response definitely raises my eyebrows a little bit. While I don't think that this is just a made-up story based on limited intelligence, I'm also not naive enough to think that the government wouldn't take advantage of a situation that plays in their favor politically. And it makes me think of that famous quote, I'll read it here: "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste," and what I mean by that is an opportunity to do things that you could not do before. And I think that that may be something that's applying here when we look at the different ways that different situations have been handled by the government, even if those situations have similarities. Now, to be clear, this isn't an area that I have a whole lot of expertise on, but I think it's helpful for me at least to sort of format my thoughts in videos like these so I can clarify how I'm currently thinking about it and maybe share some of those insights that I'm gathering with you. I'm curious what you think about this. Let me know it down in the comments. What have I gotten absolutely wrong? Or maybe you think I'm on the right track here. Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And with all of that said, I hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.